He was born in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor, lost his mother at age 9, had less than a year of formal schooling in his entire life, and was rejected, defeated, and humiliated more times than most people endure in a lifetime. Yet Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States, held the country together through its deadliest war, abolished slavery, and was shot dead before he could see the nation he saved begin to heal. This is not a story of a man born for greatness. This is the story of a man who refused to quit until greatness found him. If you want more deep dive histories like this, subscribe right now. New videos every week. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in Hardin County, Kentucky, what is now LaRue County. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and carpenter, and the family lived in extreme poverty. When Abe was 2, the family moved to a farm on Knob Creek, and when he was 7, they relocated again to Indiana, partly because of land title disputes in Kentucky and partly because Thomas Lincoln opposed slavery on moral and practical grounds. He did not want to compete with enslaved labor. Indiana was frontier wilderness. The family built a 3-sided shelter to survive their first winter, and Lincoln would later describe the years in Indiana as the hardest of his life. In 1818, when Abraham was just 9 years old, his mother Nancy Hanks Lincoln died from milk sickness, a poisoning caused by drinking milk from cows that had consumed the toxic white snakeroot plant. Her death devastated the family. Thomas Lincoln left his 2 children, Abraham and his sister Sarah, largely to fend for themselves for nearly a year before returning from Kentucky with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Lincoln's stepmother Sarah would become one of the most important people in his life. She pushed him toward education, convinced Thomas to support the boy's desire to read, and later said she knew from the moment she met him that Abraham was a special child. Lincoln had attended school only briefly, a few months here and there, totaling less than 12 months across his entire childhood. There were no formal schools in the Indiana wilderness. The family relied on what were called blab schools, where children read aloud to practice memorization. But Lincoln's hunger to learn went far beyond what any frontier school could offer. He walked miles to borrow books, read by firelight after long days of farm labor, and taught himself grammar, mathematics, and law almost entirely alone. He read everything he could find: Aesop's Fables, the King James Bible, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and a biography of George Washington that he reportedly read so many times the pages fell apart. When he was around 14, he borrowed a copy of Parson Weems' Life of Washington from a neighbor. He left it exposed to rain, and it was damaged. Lincoln walked back to the neighbor's farm and worked 3 days of labor to pay off the debt. That story tells you everything about his character. By the time Lincoln was a young man, he had grown to 6 feet 4 inches tall, extraordinary for the era, and was known for his physical strength. He worked a variety of jobs: rail splitter, store clerk, postmaster, and flatboat operator. At 19, he piloted a flatboat to New Orleans and encountered slavery in its full commercial reality for the first time. He saw enslaved people bought and sold in the markets, and those images never left him. In 1830, the family moved to Illinois. Lincoln was 21 and decided to strike out on his own. He settled in New Salem, a small village along the Sangamon River, and worked in a general store. He was popular, known for his storytelling, his honesty, and his willingness to wrestle any man in town. He ran for the Illinois state legislature in 1832 and lost. He then co-purchased a general store that failed, leaving him with debts he would spend years repaying. He was appointed postmaster of New Salem, studied law from borrowed books, and tried again. In 1834, Lincoln was elected to the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. He served 4 consecutive terms, and during this period he taught himself law so thoroughly by reading borrowed copies of Blackstone's commentaries that in 1836 he was admitted to the Illinois bar. He moved to Springfield in 1837 and joined a law partnership, eventually becoming one of the most respected lawyers in Illinois. Known for his ability to argue clearly, his integrity in court, and his genuine belief that the law existed to produce justice, not just outcomes. In 1842, Lincoln married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a prominent Kentucky family who had several suitors, including Stephen A. Douglas, the man Lincoln would later face in one of the most famous political debates in American history. The marriage was complicated. Lincoln was prone to deep depressions, which he called the hypoche, and Mary suffered from anxiety and emotional volatility. But the couple had 4 sons and remained devoted to each other through extraordinary pressures. Lincoln won election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846 and served 1 term. He opposed the Mexican-American War, calling it an unjust war of aggression, which was deeply unpopular and effectively ended his political career at the federal level. For a time, he returned to Springfield and his law practice, and for several years it seemed like his political ambitions were finished. He was 40 years old and largely unknown outside Illinois. Then in 1854, everything changed. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, authored by Stephen Douglas, which effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. Lincoln was enraged. He re-entered politics with a new intensity, arguing that slavery was a moral wrong that violated the foundational principle of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. He lost a Senate race in 1855. He ran again in 1858 against Stephen Douglas, and the two men held a series of 7 debates across Illinois, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that became some of the most celebrated political arguments in American history. Lincoln argued that a nation could not survive permanently half slave and half free. Douglas won the Senate seat. Lincoln lost again. And here is where you need to subscribe if you haven't already, because Lincoln's story is the proof that persistence is not just a virtue, it is a strategy. Despite losing the Senate race, the Lincoln-Douglas debates had given Lincoln national visibility. His speeches were reprinted in newspapers across the country. In February 1860, he delivered the Cooper Union Address in New York City, a meticulous, legally argued speech dismantling the pro-slavery constitutional argument, and received a standing ovation. That speech turned him from a regional figure into a national one. In May 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln as its candidate for president on the 3rd ballot. He won the general election in November 1860 without appearing on the ballot in 10 Southern states, and without winning a single Southern electoral vote. Before Lincoln was even inaugurated, 7 Southern states had seceded from the Union. By the time he took office on March 4, 1861, the Confederacy had already formed under Jefferson Davis. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. What followed was 4 years of carnage unlike anything the American continent had ever seen. Over 620,000 soldiers died, more than all American casualties in World War I and World War II combined. Lincoln managed the war while dealing with incompetent generals, a divided cabinet, public outrage, personal grief. His son Willie died in the White House in 1862 at age 11, and constant pressure from both abolitionists who wanted faster action and conservatives who wanted compromise. He fired and replaced generals repeatedly until he found Ulysses S. Grant, who was willing to fight the sustained, grinding war Lincoln knew was necessary. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. It was a war measure as much as a moral one, designed to weaken the Confederacy by depriving it of labor and encouraging enslaved people to flee or resist. It did not immediately free all enslaved people, but it transformed the meaning of the war. The Union was no longer fighting only to preserve the nation. It was now fighting to end slavery. Lincoln won re-election in November 1864 against his former General George McClellan, who ran on a platform of negotiated peace with the Confederacy. Lincoln won decisively. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, he spoke without bitterness, with malice toward none, with charity for all, and called for national reconciliation. It remains one of the greatest speeches in American political history. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was effectively over. 5 days later, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. At approximately 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and actor who had access to the theater, entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln once in the back of the head with a single-shot Derringer pistol. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson House, where he died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at Lincoln's bedside as he died, said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Abraham Lincoln never finished a formal education, lost more elections than he won, buried a child while managing a war, and governed through the most violent rupture in American history. He was not born into power. He built himself into it, through reading, through persistence, through an unshakable belief that the promise written in the Declaration of Independence was worth dying for. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery throughout the United States, was ratified on December 6, 1865, 8 months after his death. He did not live to see the final victory of the cause. He gave everything to advance. If this video gave you something, a new detail, a different angle, a deeper respect for what this man endured, subscribe to this channel. History is not a collection of dates. It is the accumulated record of what people chose to do under impossible pressure. Lincoln made his choice. Hit subscribe and stay for the next one.